I'll start with some pre-Snowden legislation, the CISPA, the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act, which was, we were actually working on that in the House. It had just been debated in the House. It had just passed when the Snowden revelations came out. So it was actually helpful, the timing of those revelations and disclosures, in that we could point back and say, see, this is what we were talking about could happen if CISPA passes. But when they did CISPA, it was interesting. We had classified briefings. You know, they bring the generals in and the computer experts from the CIA and the NSA, and I remember one comical briefing where there was a computer geek, and I have a lot of nerd pride, so I can call people geeks, but he was sitting there and he was doing a demonstration of how the Russians could hack into your computer. Well, he was running 2 programs on the computer at the same time. So he's actually hacking into the computer he was typing on. And that was interesting to him, but I don't think it made sense to any other of the congressmen. You know, to him, he was running 2 different threads on this computer, and so this was a novel thing he was doing. And he was typing in like hexadecimal numbers into a C prompt. You know, he's down at the root level, but he could see what was going on in the windows, and his program crashed. His simulator crashed. And he was like, oh, darn it. And the general is like standing there, like, oh, shaking his head. And I'm thinking, nobody realizes your program crashed in this room. You could just fake this whole thing. But anyways, they convinced everybody in that room that now they knew something nobody else knew, and they were qualified to vote on CISPA and vote for CISPA, even though their constituents would not have them vote for CISPA. Then we had the Snowden revelations, I'll call them, and then Congressman Amash, who is really the leader. He is the person that people go to in the House when they want to know what the legislation really does, because he has an excellent staff, and he himself just pours through these bills. So he introduced an amendment to the DoD appropriations bill to try to stop the bulk collection of all your metadata. Because actually, as Justin Amash points out, the metadata is probably more dangerous than the actual content when they can realize how you're interacting socially and who you're interacting with. So he sought to, to rein that in. And so that's the first of the 3 bills I'm going to discuss. But let me tell you why this was an amendment to an appropriations bill. The leadership and all the chairmen of the committees of respective jurisdiction do not want to reform the intelligence community's activities. They just don't want to do it. And in the House of Representatives, because the committee structure and the leadership structure, they have so much power. We can introduce all the wonderful bills we want. We're up to HR like 5,600 in this Congress. So there's been 5,600 bills introduced. But the leadership and the chairman decide which bills come to the floor. So, you know, those of us like Justin Amash and I and Zoe Lofgren that are trying to get legislation to the floor, we have to look for opportunities. And they're few and far between. In fact, it reminds me, as an engineer, it reminds me of like that first invention where they tried to do movies and this thing rotated. It was called a daedalum or a zoetrope, but it had little slits in it. You've probably seen one of these in a museum. And you look and a slit goes by and you can see a picture on the other side of the drum as it's spinning. And that's occasionally photons pass through that drum. And that's the way I look at our legislative opportunities, is occasionally there's a slit in the drum that goes by and you could get a few photons in there. And that one of those opportunities is in the form of a limitation amendment to an appropriations bill. Congress has the power of the purse, and the sort of democratic thing that the leadership has agreed to do, merely to keep their leadership, because there would be a revolt if they didn't, is to allow us to, anybody in the House, it's one of the rare democratic aspects of the House, anybody in the House can offer any amendment they want. You can write it down in your handwriting and submit it to the clerk on any appropriations bill. But it's very constrained because there are all these rules around it. You can't legislate, you can't affect existing code. All you can do is limit how the money is spent. And so that was how Justin Amash's amendment was drafted. It's very hard to achieve what we want to achieve. It'd be better if we could sit down and write a bill that goes in and changes the US code. but that's not what these limitation amendments do. And boy, he caught the attention of the world. He caught the attention of the leadership. He had the world bearing down on him for his efforts. No good deed goes unpunished. For his efforts, one of our colleagues called him in the media Al-Qaeda's best friend. And of course, that got used against him in a campaign, in a primary. And so this is what you run up against when you try to introduce legislation. That bill failed by only 7 votes, but it was heroic that we got within 7 votes, because let me tell you who voted no. Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer voted no. That's the minority leader and the minority whip. John Boehner, who's the speaker and rarely ever votes on legislation, decided to vote on this piece of legislation. He voted no. Eric Cantor voted no, and the majority whip, Kevin McCarthy, voted no. So the entire leadership voted against it. All of the committee chairmen that had any jurisdiction over this voted against it. And yet we almost got half of the House of Representatives to go against all of the leadership on both parties and all of the committee chairmen and ranking members. So, and now that gets us to an interesting point. These folks who voted against that bill was like watching them put their hands into a wood chipper, because I knew they were voting against the will of their constituents. And they went home and did town halls, the ones that will still do town halls. And I watched town halls, other congressmen's town halls on YouTube for the same reason most people watch NASCAR. It's for the wrecks, to watch the pileups. And if you try to convince your constituents you're pro-liberty and you're not, and you've got a voting record that shows you're not, you're going to have a wreck. And these folks that were on the wrong side of this vote, the ones who are still brave enough to do town halls, they went through the wood chipper back home. And this presented an opportunity. They came back and said, my gosh, we've got to do something. So let me see how much time I have here. They came back and said, we got to do something. So we had the Freedom Act. And they said, what do we do? And so Justin Amash was the leader in this, and a lot of us worked on this. And we got Jim Sensenbrenner, who was the original, actually this was his bill, but he was the original author of the Patriot Act. And he feels like he was, more or less misled when he passed the Patriot Act. They told him they wouldn't do things with it, which they actually went and did. So he wanted to right that wrong, so he introduced the Freedom Act, and a lot of us had good input into that. It started out as a great bill, and everybody wanted to do something because they were getting beat up back home. So we got like 151 co-sponsors on this thing, which is tremendous. And it had great reforms in there. Closed backdoor loopholes, stop the bulk collection of metadata without tying the hands of the intelligence community to stop or to intercept terrorist communications. It didn't tie their hands at all. And so it was a great bill. And this gets me to another point, where another one of those slits in the drum where it goes by and you have an opportunity. A great bill on its own is not going to make it to the floor of the House. Another opportunity to get your legislation on the floor is to attach it to something that must pass. And so the Patriot Act is going to, provisions of it will expire, because it's not permanent, some of it's temporary. Provisions of it will expire. So this was attached reluctantly, it was attached to the reauthorization of those Patriot Act provisions that were going to expire. But here's what happened. So the bill goes into committee and it got eviscerated. It was gutted. And then to add insult to injury, after it came out of committee, and some of us were still saying, is it worth passing? Is it not worth passing? We were torn. Is it better to take a little bit now and reauthorize the Patriot Act and get more later, as long as we're moving in the right direction? And so we sort of waited on the sidelines. We didn't condemn it yet. But then when it came out of committee, they took it to 6 different intelligence organizations in this government, and it got rewritten again. And then they brought it to the floor of the House, and there was no opportunity to offer amendments to it. In fact, at this point, it had been gutted so much and distorted so much that 75 of the original 151 co-sponsors wouldn't even vote for the bill. So you know it's changed a lot if a co-sponsor won't vote for the bill. Now the primary sponsor of bills, what I've noticed is they get this zeal for the deal, and they want to see their bill pass, and they will tolerate more playing or tinkering with their bill than any of the other co-sponsors. So Sensenbrenner stuck with it. But to show you how bad it was, all of the people that voted against the Amash Amendment, the chair of the Intelligence Committee, the chair of Judiciary, the majority leader, the minority leader, they all voted for the Freedom Act, even though they were the modified Freedom Act, even though they weren't co-sponsors. And it passed the House, and then recently there was some activity in the Senate, and somebody else will have to talk about that because I didn't track exactly the changes that happened to it in the Senate, although the vote was close over there. I'm not sure if I would or would not have voted for the Senate bill. It was a tough call. So that gets us to my bill, or amendment, which was an amendment to the DoD Appropriations Bill in 2014. Now we're a full year after the Snowden revelation and nothing has been done. And to describe the sort of mountain that you face when you try to reform the NSA or any of the intelligence activities from Congress, I need to tell you a story or a joke, if you will, that comes from the 80s, so it's a little bit dated, but it still applies. Do you remember in the 80s when you bought computers? There was no internet. You didn't go on Dell's website and buy a computer. You went into like the IBM store, and they were on pedestals, and you would go check out the PC XT. This has got an 8088 processor. It's got 512K of RAM, and they would, the salesman would tell you all the wonderful things this computer could do for your business. So at the time, there was a joke that said, what's the difference between a car salesman and a computer salesman? Does anybody know the difference? Well, the car salesman knows when he's lying to you. The computer salesman doesn't actually know when he's lying to you. Well, let me tell you, we have no shortage of car salesmen or computer salesmen on the whip team in Congress. Those are the ones responsible for describing to you what the bill does, what it actually does, and whether you should vote for it or not. And some of them will lie to you because they know they're lying to you, and some of them, probably the majority of them, don't even know what's in the bill. They just know it's their job to get you to vote for or against it. And so I wanted to read to you the advisement from the majority whip on the Massie-Lofgren amendment. This was an email that was sent to every congressional office by the whip, the majority whip. It says, whip, legislative director alert, DOD approves Massie amendment, FYI. Dear colleague, and this is sent on behalf of the House Committee on Judiciary, Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and House Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense. Dear colleagues, Islamic radical terrorists are on the march in Iraq, and the leader of ISIL has publicly threatened to attack America. Syria has become a vortex of jihadists from across the globe, and the Director of National Intelligence and the Secretary of Homeland Security have warned of the growing threat these jihadists pose to our own homeland. State control has collapsed in Libya, and rival gangs of radical terrorists have established safe havens that rival those in Afghanistan prior to 2001. Meanwhile, in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Taliban, Haqqani Network, and al-Qaeda continue to fight. Moreover, the administration has released the Taliban 5 from Guantanamo, emboldening the terrorists. The terrorist danger is grave and growing. The terrorist threat is not contained overseas. The U.S. homeland remains a prime aspiration and target. This amendment would create a blind spot for the intelligence community, tracking the terrorists with direct connections to U.S. homeland. Last month, the House overwhelmingly passed H.R. 3361, the USA Freedom Act, which expressly prohibits the government from using communications to or from a person who appears to be located in the United States, except where the communication relates to unlawful foreign target or to protect against immediate threat to human life. A similar amendment to the one offered tonight was defeated after a full debate at the House Judiciary Committee. The House voted on an overwhelming bipartisan basis to provide the intelligence community with the tools it needs to keep Americans safe while restoring public confidence that the appropriate safeguards are in place. Now is not the time to stop intercepting communications of known terrorists. Now is not the time to blind our intelligence community to the threat. Vote no on this amendment. And so that's the letter that my leadership sent to every member of Congress about this. Now, that went to their legislative team. That's the ones responsible for reading the bill and informing their congressmen of what's in the bill. Now, congressmen don't have time to read all that, so they get one sentence when they show up at the floor of the House. And here's the sentence that the whip put out. There's like 10 bills, 10 amendments. They walk in, they got to vote on 10 amendments. It's like speed round, 2 minutes per amendment. So they got one sentence here. Massie, Republican, Kentucky amendment prohibits funds from being used to fully exploit lawfully collected foreign intelligence information collected under Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. So basically prohibits us from catching terrorists. All our amendment did was require them to have probable cause and a search warrant. That's all it did. They could do everything they were previously doing. And then that's the main part of the amendment. There was a second part of the amendment which would prohibit the government, the U.S. government, from forcing our companies to put backdoors, security backdoors in their products, whether it's encryption technology that you trust. It would keep, the government presumably can make companies brain damage their products so that it's easier for the government to get to your data. And they can do that in hardware and software. So our bill also would prevent the government from forcing companies to do that. So in spite of this whip effort to keep everybody off of this bill, it passed 293 to 123. Now, I think the reason it passed, which with such a large margin, is that people are becoming more and more informed about this, and congressmen go back home and they get tore up over this, and it's like an electric fence, and the cow's put its nose to it too many times, and they don't want any part of that fence anymore. So I will concede they probably didn't read my bill, a lot of them that voted for it. But they voted for it because these are intuitive creatures, and intuitively they felt like this was the right thing to do.